Today's topic is sources of patterns. When we talked about everybody who works in the costume shop, we touched on the idea of the draper. And the draper is the person who makes patterns. A good way to think about it is a draper sculpts in fabric. They take the designer's two-dimensional idea and make it into a three-dimensional garment that the actor can actually wear. You don't actually have to make a pattern. You can go to the store and buy a pattern, particularly if you don't know how to make that pattern, how to draft it or drape it. And there are a lot of manufacturers of period clothing patterns out there. Some of them are more accurate than others. Some have been blown up to fit modern bodies because of exercise, living circumstances, the food we eat. Our bodies aren't the same as bodies in the past, and so clothing doesn't fit us the same. Also, if you're working with a pattern from the early 20th century, the sizing is different. So you have to be very careful to look at the measurements that they list on those patterns. But you can find a manufactured or commercial pattern for almost any period garment, and they'll be more or less historically accurate, but they will probably suit your purposes. Why then do we need a draper? Well, in theater, we don't always do historically accurate work. Sometimes we mix and match. Sometimes it's completely made up. Sometimes we'll use a historical pattern, but we'll adjust it. We'll give it a V-neck instead of a square neck. We'll shorten the hem. We'll lengthen the sleeves. It all just depends on what it is that the designer is looking for, because we're not making the clothing on the photograph or drawing on the front of the pattern. We're making the clothing that the designer drew a picture of. How do we do that? Well, one of the ways that we make patterns is we draft. And when you're drafting, you're working on paper, and we call that flat patterning. This is what the advanced class is working on right now, and you might see some of these around the costume shop posted up on bulletin boards and such. So using an actor's measurements, we draft out a pattern. When I work as a draper, when I know what actors I am working with that season, the first thing I do is I draft a sloper. This is called a sloper for each of those actors. A sloper is essentially a copy of the actor's body in paper. Then we'll make it in fabric, adjust it, put it back into paper so that I have an accurate shape for that actor's body. And then what I can do is I can use that shape to make other shapes. So I know it's already the right size, and now I can make adjustments to it to make it look like different time periods, to make it have the correct seams that are needed for the garment that we're making. There's a really good book, The Costume Technician's Handbook. Everybody who works in the industry knows it. And if you're going to draft a pattern, they'll say, oh, are you using Rosemary's directions? Because everybody knows this who works in the industry, like I said. There are other instructions out there. There are other books that have instructions, but this is the one that's been around the longest, and everybody knows it. Everybody was taught it in school. It is the most common one that we all use. It's the one that we use here in our classes. The other way that you can create patterns is by draping. Now, this is the way that I originally learned, because it is for people who learn visually. If you have ever watched Project Runway, this is the way you see a lot of them starting to make their patterns. You still have to follow the rules of gravity and the rules of fabric, which we haven't talked about yet, but you're going to be learning the rules of how fabric works. And you can do this live on a human body. It's just easier if you do it on a dress form because you don't have to worry about sticking them with pins. When you're working with a live human body, you have to think about not hurting that person. So we tend to do this on a dress form. You can adjust the dress form so that it is perfectly the actor's size. And then you start manipulating the fabric to create the shapes that you want. You can create amazingly complicated shapes doing this. I can't imagine having to flat pattern what this would look like, because once you've draped something, you have to lay it out. There are some really good books out there about learning how to drape, and the Rosemary Ingham book covers a little bit the basics of how to drape. You can drape a sloper. And then there are some that are specific to time periods or specific to styles. There are a couple of really good books out there on, if you've looked at Japanese fashion designers in the last 30 years, they do some really amazing, complicated architectural things, and they're all made by draping. So there are some books out there that you can learn that from. So you drape a garment, but then you have to make a pattern for it. Okay, because generally speaking, we don't drape in the final fabric, which we call the fashion fabric. We drape in something that is similar. More often than not, when we make that first mock-up of the garment, we mock up what it's going to be. We make them in a muslin. Sometimes if we know the garment is going to be made out of something that's heavier or something that's knit, we might find an inexpensive version of that fabric and make the mock-up out of that and then transfer it to the fashion fabric. But in order to transfer it, we have to have a pattern. And fabric doesn't work well as a pattern. So when you drape, you then have to lay that draping out, copy it onto a piece of paper, and then use that piece of paper to copy it into your fashion fabric. Okay, so this is what a draped pattern looks like laid out flat. You can't even tell what's the front, what's the back. It looks like there's a sleeve on the left and a sleeve on the right, but I'm not really sure that that is what they are because it's not right. So I'm not even sure what this pattern that we're seeing is going to make. It looks like it'll be a blouse of some sort, but I'm not completely sure. So this is the idea. So the original pattern for the dress on the left was draped, and then it was flat pattern. So it was laid out, patterned in paper, and it shows you how it lays out and what it looks like. If you were doing this as flat patterning, it would be very difficult to figure out these shapes. But if you drape it and then lay it flat, the shapes make a whole lot of sense. Then you go to the store and you buy this pattern from this 1950s dress and you lay it out and you go, oh, okay, that's how they create that shape. We also get our patterns from books. There are several really good books out there. These are just a few that happen to be on my shelf. And there are some people that everybody in the business knows. Nora Waugh has done the cut of women's clothes, the cut of men's clothes. She has a book that is strictly undergarments. Janet Arnold is very famous in historical costuming. She is an English woman who has actually gone into the museums and done measurements of the actual clothing with her little white cotton gloves and her. She does intricate drawings of what the inside of those garments look like, and then has laid out the patterns for those. The Tudor tailor, the Victorian tailor, there are lots of books like that that talk about also how they were constructed, what types of fabric they used, and then also has patterns in them. So there are lots of really good books that you can use. The thing about the books is that they are historically accurate to that time period. So if you were going to make this garment, it would probably fit a 12-year-old and not the actor, the adult actor that you're dressing on stage, because they're based off of historical garments. But with a sloper, I can look at this pattern and I can say, okay, this breaks right in front of the armhole. This breaks right in behind the armhole. And I can take the sloper and cut the sloper apart so that it looks like this period pattern. Then when I cut it out of fabric and sew it back together, I've made something that looks like the time period instead of something that looks modern. That is one way that we use these books. There are also books that are set to a more modern scale. Jean Honeysett and her husband, R.I. Davis, have a series of books. If you've ever watched 1960s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s period drama on PBS, all those BBC period dramas, Jean Honeysett and her husband, R.I. Davis, were probably involved in the costume crew, in designing or constructing or being the tailoring shop for those television shows. They did the BBC for decades. The pink book on the right, The Evolution of Fashion and the Patterns for Theatrical Costumes, are really great books for high school teachers because they take those garments and they simplify them. They simplify them and they make them to a modern body shape and size. So you're not having to do the multiple steps of a sloper and looking at the pattern and drafting it to a different size and laying it out. On this one, you can just blow them up and they will fit. And they have in the front, they tell you the sizes that they'll fit, so you can scale if you need to. Here's a look at the inside of those books. So it's definitely a simplified pattern that you can blow up. And there are multiple ways to blow these patterns up. I don't want to confuse you by teaching you 5 different ways to blow these patterns up, but just know that there are ways to make these much larger and make them work. So it's not that difficult to find patterns for period garments. Okay, so who makes patterns? The draper makes patterns. How do they make those patterns? They make them through flat patterning, which we call drafting. They make them dimensionally, which we call draping. And they can develop them from books of historical garments. And sometimes they use commercial patterns. It's very rare in a professional shop for a draper to use commercial patterns, but in a university setting, we use commercial patterns all the time. I would suggest that you know what all those words in boldface are when it comes to taking a quiz or a test. Thanks and have a great day.